Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast today is Ian Collins. Now, Ian is a British radio broadcaster. He's a writer, journalist, and he's been in the world of media for many years. So it's great to get Ian on. Ian, how are you?
Alex, I'm very well. Thank you for inviting me.
Whereabouts in the world are you, Ian? Where's home?
So I'm in a place called Sevenoaks in Kent, which is, absolutely your archetypal middle-class England. The people that I live and socialize amongst now are the people that I hated growing up, and I'm now one of them.
Is that where you originate from, though? Where was childhood?
No, I was born in Scunthorpe,
Okay.
and then was spectacularly removed from mighty Scunny at the age of about 2 or 3, down to Ashford in Kent, and I've kind of been Kent, London-based sort of ever since, really. So,
yeah,
family all over the place. So,
yeah, and you're back in the studio now after COVID. Has that been good?
Yeah, it's been interesting. I did the first 3 months or thereabouts from home, where you're seeing me now. So this was the studio, and it was nice. I mean, I kind of got to like it. I thought this is incredible. I mean, not only do you save quite a lot of money as well, because you're not paying out to travel and you're not buying that coffee at Costa as you do on the way and sandwiches at work. And I thought, I quite like this. I can imagine this is quite a nice life. It was quite cozy in this little sort of attic room.
Yeah.
And then when it sort of came time to go back, I was genuinely nervous. I genuinely thought, this is weird. Not being among people for a long period of time, the journey going in. I wasn't nervous about catching coronavirus. I was just a bit nervous socially. I think a lot of people experience this. And then when I eventually did go back, I remember getting on the train on that first day, and there was literally nobody on it. I mean, I certainly had the entire carriage to myself, and I think I probably had the whole train, and that was the case for months. There was just nobody there.
Yeah.
And now, of course, it's now got back to, I wouldn't say quite normal levels, but the trains are busy.
Yeah. I think there was something quite encouraging, actually. I mean, you'll have to forgive me, Ian. I do listen to talk radio, but I'm a bit of a floater. I like Ken Bruce in the morning, and he was doing his show.
He doesn't like Ken.
He was doing his show from his back bedroom, and then a bit of Alan Beswick on Radio Manchester and BBC Lancashire. He was doing his show from his back bedroom. So I think there's something quite endearing about that, actually, to the listener, to know that you were in it with us.
There is. It's funny you mentioned Alan Beswick, because he was one of my kind of. I lived in Blackpool for a couple of years, and he used to be on Red Rose Radio in Lancashire, obviously. So, and he was your late night presenter, and I couldn't believe when I started listening. I was living in this kind of bedsit in Blackpool, and somebody, I don't know whether somebody recommended it or I just found it. I thought, I've got to listen to the local station because I was into radio, and discovered this guy at night who was just incredible, absolutely incredible. I thought, this man's amazing, and he gets paid for doing this. This is his job.
Yeah.
And then, fast forward a load of years, and I end up doing the same job, and those hours as well, which was the hours I always wanted to. I always thought, working at night, dimly lit studio was, phone-in radio was absolutely right. But Beswick was an absolute, and still is, of course, in the Northwest. He's an absolute legend. In fact, only yesterday, somebody sent me a clip of him. I don't know if you saw it on social media, of him giving his opinions on Justin Timberlake's latest song. It's just, and I was straight back to that bedsit, because Beswick hasn't lost any of that kind of acerbic, very dry way of delivering a view. And he's not mentioned enough, frankly. I mean, people who know radio and know Manchester and surrounding areas know him, but when people talk about sort of the old legends of late night radio, people always talk about James Whale and the like, and a few others. But Beswick, to me, was absolutely the king of the lot.
Yeah, it's lovely to hear, because I mean, it was, for me, as somebody who was a young guy, I was at Red Rose Radio was, and he became a cult figure, did Alan Beswick, and I still think he has that following, not even now, and people would bring up and just try and swear, wouldn't they? If they could get a swear word on the radio, they'd felt that.
Absolutely. I think I did phone him once, actually. I can't remember what I said, but I'm sure I did ring him, and probably lasted about 3 seconds before he just moved on to the next caller.
He was so acidic, wasn't he? And still is. Yeah.
Absolutely. But what I find interesting looking back at that, it was that time when, local radio, where if you did a car journey, any distance around the country, as somebody who was interested in radio, I'd look forward to going through all these different, it was Piccadilly, of course, in Manchester, and you'd get Red Rose in Lancashire, and then in you get Hallam, obviously Sheffield, all of these different stations that have now mostly been rebranded, but they were all completely original. Most of them were not owned by any other big group. And they had a proper community feel about it, and they were big as well. If you went to any of their kind of road shows or whatever, I ended up working on Invicta FM, which was Kent's local station, which was absolutely massive. I mean, there was no competition then either. Yes. So you ended up, you do these, kind of, I don't know, I can remember there being a kind of bonfire night festival in a kind of big field somewhere in Maidstone or something. There was about 30,000 people there. I felt like a member of Take That. It was amazing. It was just incredible. These stations had such an impact on the area.
Yeah, I remember going to the Radio 1 roadshows on the beach of Blackpool, and they were thousands. Yeah. They were huge, and everybody loved the Radio 1 roadshow. You knew summer had arrived, didn't you, when the roadshow?
Absolutely, yeah, they were huge, weren't they? I mean, I remember when I was in Blackpool. I remember Radio 1 being there, and then I remember my sister went to the one in Margate in Kent, and she couldn't believe she'd met Kid Jensen, and it was Dave Lee Travis, whoever it was, unbelievable.
We'll leave the Radio 1 DJs there, Ian, and move on, shall we?
yeah, that could be another conversation.
So where did your kind of route into broadcasting begin? Did you go down the hospital radio route, or was it something different?
No, I was. I kind of wanted to work. I always liked radio. Growing up, we were a Radio 2 household, always were.
Yeah.
And a little bit of me felt that was a little bit old-fashioned, because the family over the road were listening to Radio 1 and we had Radio 2 on. But the reason I liked it, apart from Terry Wogan in the morning, who's still incredible regardless of your age, was that they had quite a lot of kind of talk-based shows. So obviously you had Jimmy Young, who's now Jeremy Vine, but Jimmy Young doing his kind of politics and consumer stuff. Gloria Hunniford was on midday. Then late at night, they had a couple of shows. A guy called Pete Murray did a late show as well. And it was a lot of interviewing and talking. And so I liked that aspect. And I wrote to them at Radio 2 and I said, can I come up and sit on one of the shows? And so I went up and sat on Gloria Hunniford. And it was, absolutely incredible. I couldn't believe I was sitting in a Radio 2 studio. And ironically, she lives around the corner from me now, and I see her walking the dogs, which is kind of like, there's Gloria. And I didn't really know how to get into it, though, because I never really considered that you could do work experience in radio, like doing backroom jobs. I always thought, if you want to be a presenter, how would you do work experience as a presenter? You're not going to turn up on a schedule and they go, well, stick him on for an hour.
No.
Some 15-year-old. And I couldn't work that out. But anyway, I kind of listened to the local station in Kent, and I thought, there was a late night show on then with a guy doing it, and people used to phone in to this show, a bit like the Alan Bezic thing, but it was a bit more Timmy Mallet, of course, another hero of local radio, and people would phone in, and this presenter would then invite them in the studio the following week. And I was listening to this in my car thinking, it can't be that easy to get into radio. People would ring in with really bad impressions or whatever. And the next week, this guy would invite them in and they'd be in for the next year. I thought, this is an extraordinary way to get into radio. So I kind of, just by coincidence, then got to know somebody who worked on that show very briefly. So why don't you come in? And I came in and started working with this sort of late night team. And then eventually got a gig there. But I never really wanted to play music. I kind of always thought I wanted it to be talk of some kind.
Yeah.
but I'm never quite sure what. And I've always kind of straddled that strange divide between, just having some kind of fun and talking about cultural things that are funny, retro stuff, all of that stuff we love, but simultaneously loving politics and all that goes along with that. And that's honestly, it's a blessing and a curse to be able to do those two things, because you're never quite planted your flag in one. And that's great in terms of, I suppose, your versatility. But on the other hand, people like pigeonholes in this industry, and they like to say, oh, you're the guy that does that. You're the current affairs bloke. You're the funny guy. We all know what Chris Evans does. We all know what Jeremy Vine does. And I've sort of sat in the middle of that kind of strange Venn diagram, really.
Yeah. And the change of radio has been quite dramatic, hasn't it, over the last 5 or 6 years? We've gone from kind of FM and AM frequencies and pretty much you could only listen on the radio to, well, your show's on telly now, is it? You can actually. Yeah,
I mean, I still struggle to get my head around this. I mean, the journey of that for me, when I was working in local radio, sort of wet behind the ears, 18-year-old, 19-year-old. And I was aware of these American stations that used to play, these American sort of West Coast music stations that go, and now another 10 in a row. And I used to think, who plays 10 records in a row? Over here, we have everyone's a bit of a personality, whether it's local radio or national radio. They talk between songs. I remember a guy saying to me, he said two things. He said, one, a station like that will exist in this country at some point where they just play non-stop music, or more or less. He said, and we won't have all these different radio stations. They'll all be owned by one or two groups, which sounded a bit like a dodgy conspiracy theory to me. I thought, well, how can one person own all of this? And of course, that was all quite prophetic, because on his first point, on music stations, it's fairly standard now to play 5 or 6 songs in a row. And commercial radio is owned by, 2 or 3 large companies. And then in national terms, on the talk side of things, on talk radio where I am now, everything is filmed, and it began by them filming it and just putting it onto YouTube. But now, of course, it's on every sort of digital visual platform. The smart app is on your television screen now. So, I mean, you can watch the radio. And people increasingly say to me, I bump into somebody on the train and say, oh, I watch you all the time. And I still can't quite get used to the fact that for years people have gone, I listen to you every time. And now we've moved into this word watch, which is interesting. It's a totally different discipline as well. So you're having to talk to a camera, and, you have to dress up a bit as well, because radio is always, it's for ugly people. So.
And what about the kind of explosion of podcasting, which what I'm doing now? Is that a good thing for radio, or is it a threat to the radio, or is it just part of the?
I think there's a kind of a fairly good synergy, really, Alex, between the two, because I mean, I suppose there are areas that encroach on some things stylistically. If you've got a good news podcast, I would imagine that some news stations might be a bit miffed that their news podcast from a well-established organization doesn't get as many downloads as somebody who essentially records one with their friends, and that does happen from time to time. I mean, the choice is so immense now, as you know, and it's beyond incredible that you look at your phone and you think, if I listened to, I won't be alive long enough to listen to everything that's on my phone. I've got every episode of Desert Island Discs from when it started in the 50s or something.
Yeah.
Just on a telephone. I mean, that's extraordinary. So I think it's an amazing addition.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, when I started this 7 or 8 months ago, I just didn't know whether it would work, but it seems quite niche, and it's kind of growing, and it's fabulous, because if I'd turned up at Talk Radio, with the greatest respect, and said, look, I'm a vicar, I want to talk to people about faith, I would imagine people would say, thanks, but no thanks. So it's been.
Did you look at it like that, Alex? Did you think, right, this is a great way to do religion? Was that part of it, or was it very separate?
Yeah,
because obviously there's a lot of I mean, it's not easy to fill pews these days, but well, particularly at the moment because of what's happened.
Yeah, no, it's not easy to fill pews, and it's going to get even harder, I think, with COVID. But I always wanted to bring. I kind of describe it as trying to bring God and faith to people in a palatable way, and it might be in that we spend a couple of minutes on faith and the rest of it on radio. But I think just the fact that I'm sat here in a dog collar talking to people like yourself it's pricking up people's ears, so it's great from that perspective.
It's fantastic. So am I part of some kind of weird conversion therapy that I've agreed to, and suddenly I'm going to, that's it, I'm part of the flock afterwards? I'd be delighted, by the way. I've got a problem with it. I love the fact that it works in, we're sitting talking to each other, seeing each other in different parts of the country on a screen. I mean, that is talk about miracles. That is one almost.
It's a great genre, and the guest list is just getting better and better. So it's so you are part of an esteemed community. So
it's peaked today, hasn't it? So it's
well. Let's move on.
there is. Yeah, you have got a fabulous guest list as well. I look back at some of the ones you had on. So fantastic.
Yeah, and what were you listening? Which radio stations do you see as your competition? I mean, it's just your platform, your competitors just getting broader and broader. I mean, it used to be you and 5 Live, didn't it? Really.
Yeah, I mean, there was. So when I went into national radio, I worked at Talk Sport, and Talk Sport was. Sorry, no, I tell a lie. I originally worked at Talk. There was an original Talk Radio, which became Talk Sport. So it only lasted for about 3 years, and then it was converted to Talk Sport. But they kept sort of half a dozen programs that were, or so about 30% of the day rather was non-sport. So even though it was called Sport, it was. So I ended up. I was doing an overnight show there called The Creatures of the Night, which was just sort of like 3 guys sitting in a studio, talking about everything from music and comedy and popular culture, and it was amazing. They were real kind of golden years. It was a 5-hour overnight show, and I did it for yonks. And this was on, technically on a station called Talk Sport, but even though we were sort of the non-sport side of things. And then I went to LBC, and LBC, of course, was just a London station then. And now, of course, DAB has made everybody national by definition. And as you say, 5 Live, LBC, Talk Radio. It's weird because when I first, in the 90s, when I went to Talk Radio in its original form, somebody said then, in 20 years' time, there'll be, 50 of these talk stations. In America, these big AM talk stations with these huge presenters. They've mostly historically been kind of right-wing, fairly Republican affairs, but massive dominance, across, and part of media culture in America. And my producer, Mike, at the time was saying, that's what the UK will be like in 20 years' time. And strangely enough, it's not really happened in that way. It's happened through podcasting. There's lots of talk, lots of people do a podcast with their mate and they just chat and they riff, and it might be on a specific subject. It might be about nothing at all. But actually, in terms of actual radio stations, when I started on Talk Radio, there was Talk Radio, 5 Live, LBC. And today there's Talk Radio, 5 Live and LBC. So it's kind of in conventional radio terms, it's sort of that side of it hasn't moved, although the explosion of what you can listen to elsewhere has.
Yeah. I want to ask you something a bit more serious. It's been 4 days since the Euros, and like I say, I'm a bit of a flicker. I switch around from time to time, and I want to ask you is, do you think so much radio is a good thing? I mean, the channels and the airways are full of the racist stuff about Rashford and co. And I wonder when it gets to 4 days down the line, whether it remains a positive thing or a negative thing. Just wondering what your take is on that. Can we do too much of a subject before it becomes,
I think we can actually. It's interesting because there were so many, unfortunately, this was meant to just be a football match. You hope to win it, you might lose it. Sadly, we lost it. And that really, you would hope, would be the only point of discussion. And there were two things that came out of it, really. Obviously, as we know, there was the sort of social media pile-in from some quarters that wanted to attack racially or otherwise three of our players. And that was terrible and serious. To me, actually, the biggest story was what happened at Wembley and the horrifying connections that could have been horrifying with, people stampeding towards the stadium without tickets, drug violence, terrified families. One guy, diehard football fan who's been to Wembley dozens of times in his life, called me. He was from York, and he came down with his wife, and he said it was the most uncomfortable experience of his life. Getting in the place was troubling. When he was in there, it was quite obvious people around them weren't meant to have tickets. There were people openly taking drugs. There was nobody challenging this. And of course, the security implications are vast, but the health and safety, it was only weeks ago we had, details of the inquest of what happened in Manchester, and previous to that, Hillsborough. And I have no idea how that wasn't rattling around in the minds of those in charge of organizing this. And to the point that, some say up to 5,000 fans could have. If you'd have said to somebody a week before that final, what's the chances you get into Wembley without a ticket? The question didn't even exist. It was just people would have just laughed at you. These tickets were going for thousands of pounds. So I think that was a really serious issue. And I wish we had focused more on that, really, because obviously the racism stuff is outrageous and, rightly should be debated. I tend to believe, and this may be ridiculous optimism in a curious way, that this is such a tiny contingent of people who sit anonymously on social media sites. We were talking about something on the radio today of there was a guy that has got a pub in Norwich, and he's decided that only if you're vaccinated can you come into his pub. And he's the first landlord who's put his head above the parapet, as it were, to say this. And we were hoping to interview him. And he said, actually, I've had such a pile-in from anti-vaxxers and people who want me and my family dead. And I thought, that's the same guys, the same type, the ones who abuse Saka and Rashford and co, who would happily do the same thing to a. So you've got this sort of underbelly, and it might be racism, it might be conspiracy, it might be homophobia, it might be a political opinion, but their way of articulating that has to go through this kind of prism of offense and threats and just general unpleasantness. So I think what happened was obviously important to discuss. I think the wider context is there is this kind of slightly lunatic fringe who appear to spend nothing more than, do nothing more than spending most of their time abusing. And I'm pretty sure if you looked deep enough, you'd find that the ones that were attacking footballers are also some of the people that would have been attacking, political commentators or radio presenters or the church or whatever. But choosing to do so in a way that is unfathomable to me. I don't know how you even write those words and hit send and then go to sleep at night.
Absolutely.
And I do wonder, to go back to your original question, Alex, whether, if you talk about it too much, does it kind of, is there a risk that you sort of overstate it to the point where, anyone listening in for the first time ever would think the entire United Kingdom football base or English football base were all mad racists? There's that possibility as well. And then there's the other thing of giving the oxygen of publicity to people who are generally unpleasant.
Just give us an insight into preparing for a show, because I'm not talking necessarily about yourself, but there's a desire to you want to make your show appealing, you want to stimulate debate. Adrian Durham is somebody who strikes me on Talk Sport, who he throws out the biggest fish and just waits to reel them in. what is the agenda when you're preparing for a show? Is it to create entertainment? Is it to create saber rattling? Is it to actually even to affect change in some degree, to become like a pressure group?
Yeah, I think it's probably a mixture of all of that stuff. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned Adrian Durham, because I'm on air at 1 p.m. till 4, and he's on TalkSport. So I'm on Talk Radio, he's on TalkSport at 4. And there, the TalkSport office is right next to our office. So when I look out the studio window, I see Durham diligently beavering away on his laptop. He says that Darren Goff, who he presents with, sits in a completely different part of the office, even though they get on very well. Durham is very focused on stats and getting all the stories. But so I think there is a mixture of things. I mean, certainly when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I do is check all the news wires, all the news feeds, all the newspapers, go through them all, what's going to work for us. So, a good story on radio, a lead story on Radio 4 would not necessarily be a lead story for us, although quite often it is the same thing. And it's just a case of kind of angling it a little bit and finding where is the most seductive hook. So today was the question about a report that had looked into unhealthy eating with the suggestion we need less salt and less sugar, and we should pay through taxation to make that happen. People should eat less meat. And the obvious question, which I'm pretty sure half the media were asking, is, should we put tax on sugar and salt? And we just angled it to, what the heck do you do to make this country healthy again? Which is just kind of, it amounts to the same point, but it just sits in your head a little more digestibly. So it's a case of finding those questions that just have a sense of ringing true or resonating with listeners. But then along the way, because I write a monologue each day, which is both my greatest joy and my greatest chore. It's a joy when I've finished it. And it's when I'm doing it, I sit there and think, I'm sure you know what it's like, Alex, when you've got to write something for church, and you think, hang on, did I say this last week? Have I used that line before? Did I make that funny remark on the previous sermon? Whatever. And it's a case of mixing it up. And so I do throw in, what I hope are, some cheeky lines here and there. And also some powerful questions too. I like the idea that when we do phone-ins, they matter. But we will invariably deliver them in a way that is probably more palatable and digestible and resonates more with, and it's a very tricky term to say, the average person, who is the average person these days. But there's a lot of sort of fairly esoteric, middle class, backslapping media organizations out there, and we try to be the sort of antitheses of that if we can.
Yeah, it's interesting you saying that. I mean, I often think about topics of religion. There seem to be the extremes. We're either talking about the God, is there a God, isn't there a God, or we're talking about the child abuse. I think there's not an awful lot of space for just intellectual conversation about. Yeah. That could be a Radio 4 thing. I don't know, but I think just doing this podcast, I feel there's good conversation to be had about religious matters, but some people
absolutely
shoot.
I mean, we have done literally the very root one question. Do you believe in God? And that's always fascinating, because what happens every single time is there's always a good call, regardless of religion, from someone who describes their experience and their relationship with God or their prophet, whether it's Jesus, and they talk so eloquently and passionately and intelligently that at the end of the conversation, you can't fail to have anything but healthy envy, because you think, well, actually, I want what they've got, because they're not making this up. They're clearly not mad. And so whatever this belief system is, or whatever way they found their God, is incredible. I mean, I had a conversation with a Muslim cab driver the other day. I was going to the dentist, and we started talking about I was having a tooth out, and I was explaining, isn't it amazing that you have your tooth taken out, and then within days, this gap just heals, and the bone begins to regrow, and all of the arterial system starts to the vascular system all starts to flow again. And he was nearly in tears. This guy, he said that is miraculous. He said that is the world we live in. He said, look around us, the building, the engineering, the design, the mountains. And he said, once you realize all of this and you kind of know what's behind it, you're a Christian, he's a Muslim, but you would have that in common in terms of how amazing and beautiful that is. He said, once the fog has cleared, he said, it's just an incredible feeling. And then he said to me, he said, I pray 5 times a day. He said, but I'm going to pray for a 6th time for your tooth, which was rather nice.
Yeah. Did it turn to gold or something?
Yeah, exactly. It'd be nice.
And I mean, it's just I don't want to get too deep, but the nation, as it's kind of lost its Christendom and become more of a secular nation.
Yeah.
But just from my side of the fence looking in, it seems to strike me that quite often people subliminally are using kind of church language. We need to be kinder.
That's true.
Sacco's put out a statement, love always wins, and I'm just thinking, well, that's biblical, and that's biblical.
Yeah.
But I do worry sometimes that the media companies kind of want to shut it out rather than let it in, and I do think there's a space there for religious engagement in debate. Would you?
I think that's true. I mean, yeah, I completely agree with that, because there is whenever there's a void somewhere, ignorance can often fill a void, and that's a real problem in all sorts of areas of life. So you have that kind of curious way that people have very passionate, strong views about something, but actually can't necessarily qualify it, because it's a feeling, and it's a feeling because nobody has explained a kind of counter argument or another version of things. And I do think there's but often people say when we talk about kind of standards, I suppose would be the word I'd be thinking of. People talk about what's happened to standard, what's happened to manners, and good Christian values, that sort of stuff, and then simultaneously there is that sense that that's kind of disappeared. Maybe social media has, back to those conversations about people who say horrendous things on Twitter. But then simultaneously, you've got, as you say, people speaking in quite sort of ecclesiastical tongue when they're discussing issues about mental health or understanding or inclusion and that kind of thing. So there is this curious kind of two poles almost fighting each other in a way there. But I definitely think there is a sense, and I don't know, maybe it's rose-colored glasses, that every generation says, well, it used to be better. People used to be more polite. And I do wonder, I'd love to know what would happen if social media didn't exist today. I think that would be fascinating.
Yeah, it would be, absolutely. I mean, myself included, struggled to live without my phone. My phone's usually not far away, as I'm sure yours is, we're all there. The other thing I wanted to ask you about when I observe television and listen to the radio is the kind of this desire to hold somebody totally accountable, and whether it's Boris or whether it's Corbyn or Keir Starmer, strikes me sometimes there is no room for mistakes and forgiveness, so
that's absolutely true. I think that's
it's almost like we want to see them swinging from the gallows before we're satisfied, and I don't actually think that's all that helpful, actually.
No, we live in, I always talk about this era of crass polarity that we live in, because it does seem to be that, you're either that or you're that. And if you're anything in the middle, or you understand the gray area, or which is usually the bigger area, then there's something wrong with you. I always think the Donald Trump comparison is quite interesting, the Donald Trump example, because I'm not a particular supporter of Donald Trump. I just didn't think he was a very good. I didn't think he was a very good man. Not that that's for me to judge. I didn't think he was a very good leader, in the sense that, one of the deals, I think, for the job as a leader is that you've got to try and unify, even if people fundamentally disagree with some of your core principles. You've got to be that person that go, well, I don't agree with him, but I could go for a pint with him. I think you've kind of got to have that a little bit. That to me is the quality of the leader. And so I don't think Trump had any of that, but I thought he had some interesting stuff to say in terms of standing up to the conventional script of politics. I thought some of that was actually genuinely refreshing. When he stood there and said to Angela Merkel, I'm sorry, we're paying so much for NATO, you guys aren't paying anything at all, and that's not fair. You never hear anybody say that, because the nearest they would get would be discussing it with their advisors in a room, and one of their advisors go, oh, no, you can't say that. That's not the way international politics works. So I quite like the fact that he broke a few rules in that respect. But my point to that was that whenever I talk about Trump, anything negative, you would think I was talking about people's dad. This incurious pile-in takes place. I'm accused of having Trump derangement syndrome, as the Trump fans call it. And what's fascinating about that, the only other leader that's had that in such large doses was Jeremy Corbyn. So completely different ends of the political spectrum. And yet the sort of messianic worship of their leader is absolutely illuminated in the most flagrant and graphic way. And so if you're not on team Corbyn or team Trump, it couldn't possibly be that my view of saying, well, actually, I quite like the bit where he was, he broke some of the conventional rules. That's not good enough. You're either in or you're out. And if you're not part of the gang, then you must therefore be a mad Marxist. So you're not a Trump supporter, you must be a Biden supporter. It's like, well, hang on. What about the 500 politicians in between? What about the other people from the same party? And it's that polarity that I think is really dangerous. Brexit, remain or leave. There's a lot of that going on with that. There's a bit of that with mask wearing at the moment. Are you one of the mask wearers, or will you be one of the mask wearers, or will you not be? And I don't know whether that's just Twitter that's got us there or something else.
Yeah, I think a lot about this, Ian, because I try and be diverse, and I've had George Galloway, John McDonnell, I've had Edwina Currie, Alistair Campbell, lots of political figures. And I've actually found that when I've actually just been able to talk to them for 40 minutes, like we are now, that my perception quite often has changed about them, because I'm actually listening in detail to what they've got to say. And sometimes, with the greatest respect on radio, they've got 5 minutes and it's thank you, ma'am. And it's usually quite often it's the presenter just wanted to fire the bullet that's going to take them out for a few weeks.
And get their social media moment out of it. I used to be in the press gallery at Westminster, and one of the things that always perturbed me in a good way was that was meeting politicians who I thought I was going to hate, and actually they were really nice people and got on really well with. And some you've just mentioned, oddly, and there was always that. And I thought, that's interesting, isn't it? So, and yet we kind of whip ourselves up into a bit of a frenzy.
So true. Somebody had warned me about Edwina Currie, who I found to be very endearing, and same with Galloway. Somebody said, "Oh, I won't be watching that," and gave me an extensive reason why not, and found him utterly fascinating to talk to.
Yeah, he's a completely fascinating guy. Absolutely. And John McDonnell for me was who I've interviewed a number of times, but I guess when someone's the shadow chancellor, as he was, of his party, a very senior figure in Labour, lifelong left winger, and all of that is fantastic. But I guess when you're kind of looking on as a commentator, you're judging them along with the sort of overarching tenets and policies of their party. But when on an individual level, and John McDonnell's always been absolutely lovely and decent and polite, to the point where I think, well, how come I can't just have a go at this guy now just for the sake of having a go at him? That would be sort of anti-intellectual nonsense. And I've given him a good run for his money, and he's given the same back. But it is, we don't always have to have a row.
No, very true. Ian, I've really enjoyed talking to you. It's been wonderful. I just want to ask you, Ian, if you still feel there are routes into broadcasting for people, and if there are, just maybe a few tips, just in case we've got a few students on the area looking to get in there. What's your advice now? In the old days, it was take your records, get down hospital radio, and spin the vinyl. What about?
Well, in many ways, it's funny. We did a debate about Spotify and music streaming and how artists are dramatically out of pocket compared to what used to happen, of course, in the old days. So if you get a million downloads on Spotify, which is huge, you'll get about $6,000. That's a lot of money compared to somebody who might, stack shelves for a living. But you've got to wait a long, long time to get your $6,000. But that would have been about 600 grand, 20 years ago or something crazy. And so, but what we were talking about with the artist I was discussing this with was the upside is that it's never been easier to get your music heard, because you can simply release a video, your music video or otherwise onto YouTube. You can have stuff uploaded onto Spotify. It can be out there, and you almost don't need the label in that respect. And similarly with radio, I mean, there's lots of people present. I mean, there's certain podcasts out there that, have incredibly large listeners with really good presenters, and YouTube channels that, people present and would never even consider mainstream media because they wouldn't earn as much as they're earning out of their YouTube channels. Now, I know they're extreme examples, but to bring it back to radio, so I think there is in terms of showcasing your wares on that level, I think it's absolutely true. You can have it out there and say, look, click on this. Here's me as a presenter. What do you think? In terms of actually trying to get into work at another station, I mean, that whole thing of, we have work experience people in with us every single week. There's never a time when we haven't got somebody in with us who wants to obviously work somewhere in media. And I often say, how did you end up coming in? You're a friend of somebody, which can happen. And they say, no, I just kept emailing such and such. And eventually they said, oh, why don't you come in for a week? So it's a bit of a lottery, that one, but it does oddly pay off. If not everybody gets that experience. It's not the only way to get into radio, I should say, as well. But that still happens. That was when I got into radio, that was the thing then, and it remains the thing now, that once you're in, and the thing I always say to people, Alex, is if only people knew how many jobs were available in radio. I mean, there's not a week goes past where somebody isn't running up and down the corridors going, we've got nobody to do the phones on Monday. We need an assistant producer on Tuesday. We need somebody to do some guest booking. That happens on a daily basis, almost an hourly basis. And I often think of a lecture hall of media students thinking, oh, there's never going to be any jobs. And then kind of cutting to a scene of one of the producers at our place running around saying, we've got nobody to produce this show. Because my point there is, once you're kind of in, and, as long as you don't sort of set fire to the place or something, then, there's no reason why, that isn't the start of a really nice career, because there are positions there, and there are interestingly more than I think some people think.
It does seem to be a genre that people love. I'm just thinking I've interviewed Paul Coyer, who's into radio, and Joe Wilson is a guy who's worked for the local radio Lancashire for donkey's years, and and Ian Banter from Talk Sport. You guys love it, don't you?
Oh yeah, it's interesting that it's now morphed into television, but it's so you have to think about what you wear now. There's the difference. So I normally have just before we started talking, I was wearing a shirt, tie, blazer, looking very smart. Now I'm in the casual.
You see, and I just go for
exactly. Yeah, it's a very easy wardrobe, isn't it, in your gig?
It's my day off.
There's never that moment where you think, what shall I wear today?
Well, listen, Ian, it's been fabulous getting you on, and the conversation's been great. I love talking about radio. I love radio very much, and And all the best to you down there in Sevenoaks. So it's a place I remember as a little boy. We had family down there. So
great.
But yeah, so all the best to you, Ian, and thanks for coming on the Godcast.
No, it's a pleasure, Alex, and really lovely to speak. Thank you.
God bless.
Cheers. Bye.